Okay, so once again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this last of the webinar cycle of It's Raining Green. This webinar is part of a cycle of webinars that we organize as part of a project called Citizens Observatory for Green Deal Financing. It's an observatory made up by different European organizations calling for greater transparency and a fair distribution of the funds invested by the EU in this energy transition. What we are calling for is for this transition to be truly green and just transition. In the previous webinars, we talked about energy, hydrogen, and for today's webinar, we wanted to focus specifically on the issue of care and how can we get this transition to have a feminist perspective so there can be a just redistribution and to deal with the reproduction crisis we are facing. So for today's webinar, you have several options. You can either write in the chat box, you can introduce yourselves in the chat box if you wish, you can share your thoughts. And if you want to ask a direct question to any of our panelists, you have a Q&A box. And there you can post your questions and we will ask our panelists the questions you write there in the final round of interventions. So you have these two options. If you want to just make a comment, you can use the chat box. If you have a direct question, please post it in the Q&A box. So before giving the floor to our panelists and before introducing our panelists, we wanted to kick off this webinar with a video that we've recorded together with people from CAPO to share our view on the important role that care should play in this EU green transition.
The EU's green and just transition is not as green and just as it appears. It is a transition led by big corporations aimed at being profitable for these big corporations. Which are the implications of this gray and unfair transition for women and LGBT people? Let's put on these glasses to have a feminist look at the European Green Deal. The Recovery and Resilience Facility, the key instrument at the heart of the Next Generation EU, is basically focused on financing technology and digitalization. It seems like technology will solve everything. But how are technology and digitalization supposed to solve the inequalities based on gender or race or the unfair distribution of care work? A just transition needs to focus not only on qualifying for high-tech jobs, but has to promote the expansion of necessary jobs to sustain life. Nursing home workers, psychologists, care workers, doctors, nurses, teachers. We need more of these jobs with improved working conditions. But in the EU's big plans to finance its transition, this is not foreseen. For example, Spain will receive 160 billion euros from the Next Generation EU funds. These are public subsidies and loans to fast-track the green and digital transition of the European economy. Of the 76 billion euros of public subsidies, more than half will be delivered through PERTEs, which are large public-private partnerships. And hey, we can find PERTs which are only and solely dedicated to health, like Salud de Vanguardia, which will receive 1,650 million euros from public subsidies. But then we see that these projects are co-defined, surprise, by big pharma associations. So no, there won't be investments in better salaries, primary healthcare, or communities. There will only be investments in what can rapidly grow the PIB or benefit the big corporations. The people most affected by these policies are those who suffer the most from health inequalities: migrants, working class people, and, of course, women. So instead of enhancing and reinforcing public services, the EU funds will support public-private partnerships and strengthen privatization options. More money and more control for big corporations. An eco-feminist transition needs to push towards sufficient public funding, public and communal ownership, and management of basic rights. Care, health, education, food, water, energy, or transportation. Working on basic needs has to be valued and reorganized with more investment and by legalizing migrant workers. A feminist perspective must be applied so that not only women are assuming care work. And the relations between the global north and the global south need to be reshaped in order to assure that the improvements of the workers from the north are not at the expense of the rights of women and indigenous people from the global south. Green, to be truly green, has to also come with truly purple, with a feminist lens.
Bueno, ara, un cop vist el vídeo,
Okay, so
passarem
after
ja a
watching this
donar
video,
veu a
I will
les
now give
ponents
the floor to
i
our
amb la idea, no,
panelists.
com dèiem,
The idea,
de
as we were saying
seguir
before,
desmuntant, no,
would
quina
be
és aquesta
to
mirada o
kind of
aquesta proposta que fa la
look
transició
into
verda
the
europea i
proposal of
quina
the
seria la
green
nostra proposta, no? Sabem que
transition,
venim
confronting
d'una
it with our own
pandèmia en la que
proposal.
s'ha
We know
posat
that
sobre
we're
la
just
taula
emerging from
tots
a
els riscos que
pandemic
comporta tenir uns
where
serveis
we've
públics
seen
privatitzats, tenir
the risks
un
of
sistema de
privatizing
cures
public services and
basat en
having
l'explotació
a
de
care system that's
majoritàriament
based
dones
on
arreu del món i,
exploitation
per
of mostly
tant, tenim
women
moltes
around the
propostes
world.
feministes,
So
no?,
we
de
have
com
many
hauria de ser una
feminist
transició
ideas
verda
on how
postpandèmia que
this
posés, no, en el
post-pandemic
centre resoldre
green
totes aquestes
transition should
crisis i
be
totes
so that
aquestes
we can
situacions
overcome all of these
d'explotació que
crises
genera
and
aquest
all of
model de
these
cures,
situations of
però
exploitation
estem
linked
veient
to
que
the
el
care
model que
model.
planteja
But
la Unió
what we are
Europea i el
seeing is
model que
that
es
the
planteja
model
en general a
put
tot el món
forward
és una
by the
transició
European
que, en lloc
Union
de
and in the world
posar
in
diners,
general
posar
is a
inversions per
transition that
resoldre, no?, i
instead
per
of
invertir més en uns
investing
sistemes
in
públics que garanteixin unes
better
cures
public
dignes, que
services
garanteixin
to
uns
ensure
sistemes que no generin
proper
més
care
precarietat ni
and systems that
vulnerabilitats,
won't lead to
no està
vulnerability
passant, no?
and
I, bueno, tot
precarity
això
isn't
ho
happening.
estudiarem, ho analitzarem molt
And we will
millor
be looking at
amb
all
les
of
ponents que
this
tenim pel
with
dia d'avui,
our
que els hi demanaré que
panelists
es
for
posin
this
la càmera un
afternoon.
moment per
I
poder-vos-les
will ask them
presentar.
to kindly turn on their cameras
Començarà
while I introduce them.
la seva
First,
intervenció
we
la
will be
Tuscany
hearing
Bell, que
from
ella és
Tuscany
coordinadora de
Bell.
polítiques
She
de
is
l'àrea
the
de serveis socials i
coordinator
joventut de
for
la
social
Federació Europea
services
de
and youth
Sindicats de
policies at
Serveis
the
Públics,
European Public
EPSU,
Service Union,
i ella ens parlarà
EPSU.
de l'anàlisi que
And
fan sobre les
Tuscany
polítiques
will be
públiques
sharing with
europees
us how
en
they
l'àmbit
analyze
de les
European
cures.
policies in the
Després
field
intervindrà
of
la Blanca
care.
Bayas, que és
Then we will
investigadora i
give the floor to
responsable,
Blanca Bayas,
companya
who is a
de l'Observatori del
researcher
Deute en la Globalització,
from
i
the
ella està
Observatory del
especialitzada
Deute en la
en serveis públics
Globalització,
i ecofeminismes, i en
specializing in
concret és
public
coautora de
services and
l'informe Els
ecofeminism.
PERTE,
She is
com
the
la inversió pública
co-author of
soscava
the
la
report
transició ecofeminista, que és
PERTE,
una
How the
publicació
Green
en la que vam
Transition is
analitzar
Undermining the
quines
Feminist
les
Transition. It's a
conseqüències, no,
publication where we looked at the
d'un PERTE, d'un projecte
consequences
específic
of
sobre
a specific
de l'àmbit, no,
project
dels Next Generation.
in the field of
En
next
tercer lloc,
generation
parlarà la Lissette
plans.
Fernandez, que ella
Thirdly,
és
we will be
treballadora de
hearing from
cures i
Lissette
integrant del
Fernandez.
sindicat
She's a
Sindillar o
caregiver
Sindiogar,
and
que és un
she's
sindicat
part of the
independent de
union
treballadores de la llar i les
Sindiogar, which
cures
is an
aquí a
independent
Barcelona.
union
I ella ens
of
parlarà
domestic
més
and care
concretament de
workers in
l'experiència de les
Barcelona,
treballadores i de
and
les
she will be
propostes
sharing
i
with us the
estratègies de
experience of
resistència que estan
the
construint
workers and their
front a aquest model, no,
and
de cures que
resistance
dèiem.
against
I per
the
últim, tancarem
care
amb la
model.
Flora Partenio,
And
que és
last but not
investigadora
least,
i
we will
activista
end
argentina i
with
membre de
Flora
l'organització
Partenio.
Down,
She is an
que és una xarxa feminista
Argentinian
del sud global,
researcher and
i ella ens
activist, is a
portarà més
member
la
of
proposta de les
Dawn, and
alternatives, de
she
com
will share with
caminar
us
cap a un model
their
ecofeminista
alternatives as to
que
how
no no es
advance
basi,
towards an
no, en
eco-feminist model
l'explotació i en la
that isn't just
vulnerabilitat,
based
tant en
on
l'àmbit de les cures com des d'una
exploitation and
perspectiva més general,
vulnerability
crec.
in the field of care,
I,
and
bueno,
also in a
fetes
more
aquestes
general
presentacions, crec que li donarem
way.
la
So
paraula
after those
directament a la
introductions, I
Tuscany
will
Bell.
give Tuscany
La
Bell the
pregunta que li
floor.
fèiem perquè
The
orientés la
question we
seva
had for
presentació
Tuscany
era
to guide
quin
her in her
anàlisi fan
presentation
des
is,
del seu sindicat de
what
les polítiques
is
públiques
your view
europees
at EPSU
en
on
l'àmbit de les
European
cures
public
durant la
policies
pandèmia
within
i
the field
postpandèmia
of
i si
care
creuen
during
que
the
aquestes
pandemic and in the
polítiques estan
post-pandemic
profunditzant la
era? Do
privatització i
you believe that
precarització
these
del sector.
policies are
Moltes
deepening the
gràcies, Tuscany,
privatization
per
and precarization
oferir-te
of
a
the sector?
participar
Thanks
d'aquest
so
webinar.
much, Tuscany, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to be part of this very important discussion. As Julia said, my name is Tuscany Bell, and I'm Policy Coordinator for Social Services and Youth at EPSU, the European Federation of Public Service Unions, which is the European Trade Union Federation representing the care sector. So to respond to your question on policies in the care sector, I think it's important to start by looking further back than 2019 and emphasize that the problems we saw during the pandemic did not begin with the outbreak of COVID. In fact, it was the policies of the previous decade which left the care sector so vulnerable and so ill-equipped to handle the pandemic. So I'll start by giving a bit of context. Staff shortages in the care sector have been worsening for the last decade at least. The population has aged and the demand for long-term care has grown at a much quicker rate than the growth of the workforce. And to demonstrate this with a couple of statistics, as an average across the EU, in 2011, you had 4.8 long-term care workers per 100 people over the age of 65. But by 2016, this had dropped to only 3.8 long-term care workers per 100 people over the age of 65. And by 2050, if we look forward, over 1.6 million more long-term care workers will be needed just to keep the coverage at the same level that it is today, which is already very bad. So we already have very big staff shortages. And due to staff shortages, in many situations, the care workers are not able to provide the level of care that they want to provide and the level of care that the recipients deserve. And this places an extra emotional burden on the care workers. It increases psychosocial risks, leading to burnout, and therefore perpetuating the vicious cycle where care workers have burnout, so they leave, staff shortages worsen, and this again increases psychosocial risks and more burnout. So it's very hard to attract new workers also to the care sector. And one of the main reasons for this is the low pay. Despite the strenuous nature of care work and its fundamental value to society, many care workers in the EU are in the bottom third of the wage distribution. As Julia said, it's also overwhelmingly dominated by women, and there's a very strong gender dimension to why it is so undervalued. While low pay is common across all health and care sectors, an EPSU report found that the higher proportion of women workers, the lower the average relative income. So that's a bit of context for the last decade. And now looking towards the policy responses of governments. Unfortunately, despite clear warnings, the policy response in many EU countries has been market driven. Austerity measures and the retrenchment of the welfare state following the 2008 financial crisis opened the way for outsourcing and the commodification of the care sector. And this has had really disastrous consequences across the EU. So even though private care providers are substantially funded by state subsidies, they have been able to extract millions from the sector in profit, in real estate, also in management fees and in debt schemes. Another problem with the commodification of care is that competitive tendering and profit-orientated strategies have encouraged cost cutting, they have driven down wages, and they have made care sectors less available for low-income communities because private providers tend to go where there are high-income communities that can pay a lot of money for the services. The market mentality has also fundamentally changed the nature of care work. So the more traditional understanding of care, which is caring to the emotional needs of someone, to the physical needs, to the health needs. This came into conflict with market logics of measure, of profitability, time constraints, cost reduction, and standardization, and economies of scale. So in order to make the care provision more efficient, the relationship building aspects of care have largely been replaced with repetitive, standardized tasks which should be completed as quickly as possible. And this way of organizing care has definitely deepened the precariousness of the sector. And it also helps to frame the profession as low skilled and therefore justify low wages. Another policy response that we have seen is that rather than tackling staff shortages and making the sector more attractive by improving the pay and the conditions, many EU countries have instead relied on low-paid migrant workers to fill the gap. So there are some policies of the last decade, and jumping forward to your question about policies during the pandemic and post-pandemic, I think, one positive, if we can say that, thing about COVID is that it really made a lot of the issues in the care sector visible. So policymakers and the public as well became aware of the underfunding, the understaffing, the neglect that have characterized the care sector. There have also been a number of very well publicized scandals in for-profit care homes, which have made visible the dangers of commodifying care. So I won't go into detail too much, but one notable example is Orpea. Orpea was previously Europe's largest for-profit care provider. I think they also have homes in Spain. And in 2022, at the beginning of 2022, a book was published detailing the company's abuse of workers and of residents. So including things like restricting the food and the sanitary products for elderly residents, low pay, illegal use of temporary contracts, union busting, tax avoidance, many more issues. And this book again opened the eyes of policymakers and the public to the deep structural problems that we see in the care sector. So taking stock of these issues, the European Commission published at the end of last year the European Care Strategy, which recognizes that care is a public good. So that's already a step forward, and also recognizing that there cannot be a resilient care sector without a resilient care workforce. So again, that's a positive step. It also recognizes that a lack of strictly applied high quality standards can lead to neglect and abuse of care recipients and poor working conditions for carers. However, whilst it does call for tighter quality mechanisms, given the gravity of the human rights abuses in for-profit facilities, such as the Orpea scandal that I just mentioned, but it's definitely not limited to Orpea, the care strategy does not go far enough. It's clear that we need far-reaching structural changes to ensure that public funded intended for those in care is spent on those in need of care in a way that upholds human rights and dignity of workers and recipients, rather than being extracted in the form of profit or real estate or anything else. And in addition to tighter regulation, the care profession needs to be fundamentally revalued, both in terms of pay and conditions. So this means reversing the market mentality that broke down care work into a series of repetitive and standardized tasks. To improve equality and ensure the right to care for all Europeans, we need high quality formal care services which are based on need. And this should be, or care services should be integrated into national social protection systems, which are best placed to deliver on an equitable basis. Another policy proposal that comes out of the care strategy is to improve or to regularize the pathways of migration for care workers. And this proposal was made as well in another recently adopted EU policy, which is the Skills and Talent Package, to explore legal avenues of migration in care, in innovation, and for youth. But this again, that the skills talent package is also problematic because while recognizing and protecting the rights of undocumented migrant care workers is of course very important, the package as it's been published does not incentivize member states and employers to improve pay and conditions to attract a local workforce. So instead, migrant workers will be subject to these often substandard conditions and low pay. And worryingly, the talent pool matching scheme that is included in this package, it resembles very outdated models of labour migration, which are designed for employers and driven by employers, and is basically a way of employers going to a country and saying, we want these workers, without ensuring any of their rights. And without a kind of focus on the well-being of the workers. So the focus needs to not just simply be a question of matching skills, but rather about helping migrant workers access decent and good quality jobs based on the principle of equal treatment. So maybe just one more policy that I can mention at EU level, which will have relevance for the care sector. The European Care Strategy is complemented by the recently adopted EU Minimum Wage Directive. The Minimum Wage Directive requires member states to set adequate minimum wages based on indicative reference values, for example, 60% of the gross median wage or 50% of the average wage. And as many care workers are employed on minimum wage, their salaries will likely increase with national minimum wages. The Minimum Wage Directive also requires 80% collective bargaining coverage of employees. And as it stands, the care sector has very low collective bargaining coverage. So that would also increase with the Minimum Wage Directive. And I will just quickly conclude by responding to your question on whether privatization is deepening. There are a lot of challenges because of the growth of big multinational care companies. But at the same time, we are starting to see some more pushback against providers profiting from care. Many countries are introducing, or at least proposing, contemplating legislation which would limit or even reverse the privatization of care. So some examples include in Germany, in Norway, and in Belgium. I'll stop there. I hope I wasn't too fast and you could understand some things, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat, and I will post the link to the book that someone asked for. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tuscany. That was really interesting, and you stuck to time perfectly. Thank you so much for summarizing the situation at a European level with all of these data you've given us on new policies that are underway and which are good to know. I also wanted to share with you a link to a piece of research we did jointly together with other European organizations. It's a gathering of papers on care sector. There are other scandalous cases generated by large multinationals in the care sector, such as Orpea, Domusvi, and others operating in the state of Spain. So after that, we will move on to our second intervention by Blanca Bayas. And Blanca will be telling us more specifically about the European recovery policies and their role in the field of healthcare and care. And if there's time, we wanted to ask Blanca to share some proposed alternatives for an eco-feminist transition. Thank you so much, Blanca, for being with us. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to focus my intervention on echoing what Tuscany was saying on how we arrived at the pandemic where it had become more than obvious that the situation of healthcare and care and basic rights wasn't at all something we could give for granted for many collectives and for vast sectors of society, both in Barcelona and in Catalonia, but it also applies to the rest of Spain, Europe, and to the whole world. And this responds to the fact that we have an economic model and a political proposal that does not guarantee the reproduction of life, and it doesn't guarantee care. It's a model that only pushes for commodification. During the pandemic, it became obvious. We reached a point where public services weren't receiving the necessary investment, where care and healthcare systems didn't receive the investment they needed. And if we look back in the last 3 years since the pandemic started, what we continue to see is that the state budgets for social services is insufficient. We saw how in early 2023, there were a series of struggles at a European level. We started the year with demonstrations from healthcare workers, and in Spain, in Madrid, there were massive rallies. Also here in Catalonia, we saw demonstrations in other European countries, in France, with a struggle for pensions. Also in the UK, people took to the streets to defend public services. And in light of this context, and I'll be focusing on what happened with the European recovery funds, and mainly what has happened and what is happening in Spain with these recovery funds. As we said at the start of the video that you were able to watch when we kicked off this webinar, in the video we saw how there are these PERTEs. These are the projects through which the European recovery funds are channeled to the Spanish state. And an important part, more than 30 billion euros, are channeled through these PERTEs, which basically are public-private partnerships. For us, public-private partnerships are a way of channeling public funds to the private sector, which is concentrated mainly in the hands of transnational corporations. And this doesn't meet social needs. And even if they've been portrayed as being green and digital, they are not feminist or environmentally friendly in any way. So in this publication mentioned by Julia before, which is how public investment is undermining the ecofeminist transition, which has looked at 5 of these PERTEs, and that is those relating to water, food and water, energy, healthcare, and care. And the conclusions we reached on these public-private partnerships is that A, they do not explain or relate to rights. They always refer to dimensions as industries that may continue making a huge profit for corporations. So as I said, they don't refer to water, energy, food, healthcare, or care as rights, but rather as potential industries that can be escalated. As I said, these are public-private partnership schemes, so it'll be the large corporations that will be providing these services. So there is no public or community service side to this. There's no way that this can be managed from a local level or from social movements. There's no community dimension to this. When they look at the conception of these dimensions, it's with growth dimension, looking at them as industries where digitalization is placed at the heart. And with this, what I mean is that the public-private partnership for healthcare isn't focusing on the socially needed healthcare, and it has nothing to do with bringing dignity to working conditions or improving primary healthcare. And here in Catalonia would be necessary because primary healthcare has been underfunded for many years now. The healthcare budget and what healthcare work is asking is for 20% of the healthcare budget to be allocated to primary healthcare, but the budget is much lower than that. So these private partner, public-private partnerships are supporting digitalization strongly, and it'll be corporations in the market that will be providing these services. And this comes also with the fact that they have no consideration of environmental aspects. For instance, they talk of the production of renewable energies, but they only include a document that needs to be signed saying that they'll cause no significant harm, but there are no indicators to back this. They will look at the pollution these industries would generate once they are up and running, but they don't look at the environmental cost of producing these technologies and all of the impacts that would happen in our territories, and also importantly in the territories of the global south. For these technologies to be developed, you need a series of materials and minerals that just add on to extractivism. They make no mention to the impacts that would come from producing all of this technology, the pollution and the waste generated from this. And therefore, we think this is a greenwashing proposal. And in Spain, a lot has been said about how these funds are feminist, but we believe that these funds do not respond to the alternatives put forward by feminists because, as I said, they do not consider socially necessary work. They do not consider aspects such as sustainability, and they don't come with any indicators proving that these public-private partnerships will take our needs into account. So, having said this, we understand the European recovery funds aren't working for an eco-feminist transition, a much needed transition that we need in this context of a crisis in the field of care, social services, and ecological. And we believe that we should truly support the public dimension of these services so that we could move towards a remunicipalization of many of these services. On the one hand, healthcare and education in some contexts can be seen as a public service, but we are also seeing a greater modification of these two sectors. And then when we talk of energy or care or water even, these are highly commodified. Very often they're no longer considered public services, although we say they should be public services. And therefore, from our alternative model, we would support the idea that all of these services have to be rights, they have to be publicly backed even, and that they can be provided for from a community level based on feminist, social, and solidarity economies. And therefore, the alternatives come through public community level solutions for all of those fields that are necessary for life. We shouldn't see energy as something for profit for companies, but rather as a social need. In this regards, we support energy through local energy communities. Just to give you one example, in all those fields necessary for life, during the pandemic, we saw many proposals. A lot was said about socially necessary work, as Tuscany said, but we haven't seen this going hand in hand with an increase in public service, social service budgets, and it doesn't seem to seem set to change. I think we need to come up with stronger ideas when it comes to the planning. Right now, there is no planning for what we need, and we cannot just blindly believe that there can be permanent growth. Rather, we need to plan better what we need, and we need to think about the planetary boundaries. We need to look at degrowth. We have to decommodify. We shouldn't support public-private partnerships, but rather community-public levels, and we need much more democratization of the economy, and we have to relocalize many of these services because it's from a local level where we can break away from these unjust global chains. That is where we are supplied many of the services like energy or food. For instance, when it comes to energy and food, we rely on energy and food traveling lots of kilometers, and we need local solutions. So I would leave it at that. I'd just like to add that it's important to intersect in our struggles in the public fields, also in the community levels. We have to converge with the anti-racist struggle, especially in the field of the care services and in more generally speaking, in all services that are necessary for life. And we have to fight back against unjust laws towards racialized population. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to recommend you to search or to look for the document. Beyond speaking about the specific program through the Next Generation funds, I believe it's an excellent example to better understand what are the transition patterns stemming from the European Union and that have been designed for the interests of large multinational corporations, undermining the needs of citizens. So even if we have an eco-feminist transition model, and even for quite a long time, from different environments and sectors, we're putting forward management alternative to better manage collective needs and commons. When there is a public investment that could contribute to such patterns, the investment, instead of going to key sectors to ensure life and reproduction, it's put at recovering the economic model of large corporations. All the speakers have raised the specific dimension in the field of the care economy. Well, the care sector is a feminine sector. It's also racialized, occupied mainly by racialized women. And we would like to ask Lissette Fernandez to tell us more about it, because from the Sindilar trade union, we would like to ask her what is the impact of recovery policies for workers. How have you, care workers, experienced the pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery period? Because there have been very important announcements to put forward grants and public grants for domestic workers, but we would like to know if such grants have been really useful, or if you rather believe that the policies that have been implemented have worsened the exploitation of care workers. And we would like to ask you, how are you getting organized from a feminist alternative trade union movement like the one you represent? And thank you very much for sharing this space with us. Thank you to all of you. Good afternoon. It is quite a challenge to be here because there's very little time to say a lot. So, of course, we have a lot to say. I'm not good at speaking slowly, so I would like to apologize to the interpreters and thank them for their work. My name is Lissette Fernandez, and I'm an activist and a domestic worker. I'm an activist in an independent trade union called Sindilar. First and foremost, in the context of the, well, as a result of the questions you asked regarding the impact of the so-called recovery policies for domestic workers. So the first question that came to our mind is, what wants to be recovered at the expenses of whom, and who is going to pay for the cost of these recovery policies? Who is going to have to put their bodies for the European recovery? We would like to briefly share with you a few elements about how in the last few years Spain and the different Spanish governments have positioned themselves when it comes to granting us the rights we deserve as domestic workers. First of all, we would like to start by underlining that the labor relationship between domestic workers and employers was first regulated in the Royal Decree 1284. But of course, we know that the care has always been provided by women. Care services have always been provided by women, but with no formal labor relationship. This Royal Decree was updated with RC 1256. By the way, a RC that have been asked for quite a long time by domestic workers movement, and thanks to our struggle, we managed to re-adapt the document. It's been 16 years of silence with a significant change in migration flows. So the idea according to which male were migrating really changed. And of course, migration patterns have also changed significantly. And the situation in Spain has been that we have become somehow freelancers. We're not independent of our social class, of course, because our social class really defines us. So when we migrate to Spain, our only market niche is the care economy. This royal decree is not designed to grant social services such as social service related grants. It does not regulate the real cotization by real salaries, which undermines us in the long run when it comes to the total amount we deserve in concept of retirement wage. The responsibilities of the labor inspection are not clearly defined because our work takes place in a private environment. And this RC, the Royal Decree, does not cover a series of concerns that the sector has raised for quite a long time, such as the race perspective, which is totally denied in the Royal Decree. It is not stated anywhere that the sector is racist and in denial of the gender perspective. We launched a request to have access to an unemployment benefit in 2019. In 2019, we were not listened. we were said, or we were told that there was a lack of budget so that us domestic workers could have access to this right. The year after, the COVID-19 pandemic started, so we suffered a great deal because we had no right to an unemployment wage. During the pandemic, they approved an extraordinary grant, very difficult to access for many of us because many of the actions needed to have access to the grant had to be done by the internet. It wasn't easy. It was not easy to access this extraordinary grant, not to speak about the numerous irregularities that the situation underline when it comes to the domestic work, and even more importantly, regarding the women that put their body at the service of domestic work. This extraordinary grant, once again, left behind the gender and the race perspective. Only colleagues in a legal situation in Spain could have access to the extraordinary grant, as I said before, and as many of my colleagues have said, it was extremely difficult to have access to this special grant. Another important topic in the sector, we oftentimes work in what we call a legal manner, but there is uncertainty about the real salary that is to be obtained. There's a certain ambiguity when you work at the domestic level. There is a clear lack of rights because we have no representation, no legal representation. So employers are individual employers and not companies. So this list of circumstances in the field of the care economy has been denounced by activists and care workers, by those of us who are organized. We have been denouncing the situation. We have been participating recently. For example, we launched a public consultation to raise the gender perspective debate. Before getting into the public consultation, I should say that the royal decree from 2011 was modified, updated as a result of a ruling that we won at the European Court of Justice, in which we said that we had no right to an unemployment wage, and this is a gender-based discrimination. And as a result of this, the Spanish government had to update the royal decree from 2011, but we have never been clearly included in the law on safety at work, not to speak about a fundamental element which has to do with safety at work, which is labor-related conditions. We are at risk of several conditions: muscular lung cancer, as a result of the chemicals that we inhale. So this royal decree did not only include the gender perspective, but also talked about the importance of setting up a gender committee to discuss all these items. And in this public consultation that was approved this year, late, because in the first response, the period announced to set up a catalog of labor conditions and their inclusion in the social labor ministry. Well, it was not done in 6 months. And for us as activists, speaking about the gender perspective at the European Parliament was important, but now when it comes to the inclusion of a list of labor-related conditions in social security schemes, was undermined. I don't know how much time do I have left. There is a lot of information, very needed, very timely to better understand this perspective. But we just wanted to say that there is no doubt that here in Spain and the different governments in Spain have no intention to regularize and give true solutions to the concerns of women working in domestic work. Of course, Spain has a very high demand of care because there is an important aging of the population, and of course, there's a certain denial that those of us in the sector are mainly migrant women. The bill does not refer to housing solutions for those who work in-house. There is no reference to the migration law about how to regularize domestic workers. There is no specific regulation so that we can have access to all our human rights so that we can experience a real positive impact. The regulation approved last year grants us an unemployment wage, but actually this will not be effective until 2024. So once again, we are faced against an incredible administrative burden. Everything is digitalized, and of course, this entails many difficulties beyond having advantages. For us, the way to face this situation is to be organized in a trade union, in a feminist trade union of domestic workers. And of course, we need to mobilize our colleagues. We need to understand that we are empowered. We are trade unionists. We are highly organized. We are attentive. And we are attentive also when it comes to developing alliances, because we believe that by building alliances from the trenches, well, this will be the only possibility to denounce the situation in the sector. Now, to conclude, I would like to say, in order to go back to what Tuscany Blanca was saying, that in the sector we have been working for quite a long time to denounce private companies that are making millions thanks to legal loops. This is something that would have to be retained in the legislation. The privatization of care should not be allowed by law. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lissette. And thank you very much for sticking to the time. You're making my task very easy. I am going to switch to Catalan now. We're getting to the end of the first round of presentations. We're going to give the floor to the last speaker, Flora. First of all, I would like to underline something that Lissette mentioned, which is extremely important when we include a gender perspective in the transition process, which is for what workers are we rescuing? Because when we speak about the green economy, about green jobs for a greener economy, we think about industrial workers that will somehow disappear and how to find alternatives to these jobs that will be lost. But there is no debate about these essential workers who are sustaining life and whom, in a context of transition, prioritizing investments in the digital capitalism and the green capitalism are in a, let's say, second plan, right? So all the grants that Lissette was mentioned will be cut unless we do something about it, or there will be an administrative burden which will make the enjoyment of human rights impossible. Having said that, I'm going to hand it over to Flora, the last speaker. We're getting to the end of the session. So please remember that we have opened the Q&A. You can leave your questions there because after Flora's presentation, we will open a short Q&A session. It is indeed a pity, but unfortunately, we cannot give you the floor right away. You can only send the questions in writing, so if you want to leave your questions, we'll be more than happy to listen to them. Flora, we have invited Flora because we wanted to have a global perspective about the transition mode in the care economy from a feminist perspective, and not only in Europe, but at a larger scale. Flora will tell us more about her experience in Latin America and about the model which is being imposed in Latin America, as well as the different alternatives that are being built by grassroots organizations in order to avoid that the care economy is based on exploitation. Flora, we would like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about all these alternatives. Hello, and thank you very much. Julia, thank you to the team and to the colleagues who are sharing this round of debates. Lissette, Cani, Blanca. Thank you very much, because the question you ask on whether there is a room for the care economy and for feminisms in the transition, I could answer back with two questions while thinking about the proposal that you mentioned, right? Why should there be such a space? What is the urgency we're claiming for so that such space exists? There's a very solid proposal led by ODG, which would be, how can we fund such forums with public funds? And the second question that I could ask you is the following. Is it, there is a forum of this nature, but I mean, there's a lot of debate about the care economy, about feminism, but this is not having a real impact in terms of real actions that contribute to developing a different crisis scenario. And the colleagues that spoke before me made an excellent comparison between the global north and the global south. In this sense, I believe that we come from a process in which the development of alternatives and the placement of topics in the public agenda has had deep impacts. Here in Argentina, we should refer to a long struggle that took for more than 15 years, and I am referring to the law on the right to abortion. And in this framework, in the framework where the crisis in the care economy expressed itself very clearly, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in other latitudes in many EU countries, not to speak about the countries of the global south. So it's fair to say that this way out of the crisis, because in different places it has a different name. We're not having a green process, not to speak a neutral, a climate neutral, or a gender or race neutral process, and it's not digitally fair. And this is the reason why we reaffirm and consider that we need to build this space and reinforce it. Be it, I mean, the character is depending on the way the crisis is expressed in its environment. In our countries, we are amidst a process of renegotiating the external debt. The IMF is back to Argentina, so the weight of certain structural factors can make it more difficult or more complex to move forward. So I would like to speak about, or to raise 4 points. I would like to share my presentation with the colleagues. There we go. I would like to go through 4 points, which somehow contribute to understanding what are the potential alternatives and their limitations. And the first point I would like to raise is, why should the care sector have a special space? Well, first of all, because planning and coordinating care has proven to be incredibly unfair from an income perspective, but also there's what we call time poverty, which affects mainly women. There's also a gap in terms of access to different resources and services. There is a direct link between time poverty and energy poverty, which is at the core of the debate, at the center of the debate of the fair transition and the debate on the energy transition in countries where the lack of access to urban infrastructures are severe, and more so access to energy, which still today proves to contribute to an overburden of care. And fourthly, because the everyday life management and the everyday life management of care turns into debt, the increase of debt resulting from an overburden of care. And this is proven by several research here in Argentina and elsewhere. So this would be the first point for us in the agenda, which is part of the empiric evidence developed by feminist movements. So there is a clear amount of input and empirical evidence and data, as economists like. And then we need to better understand and reflect about how all this gets into the public agenda. And here I would like to share a couple of examples from different countries and with different pathways regarding the proposal of a holistic care system. The first example is from my country, here in Argentina. We have a debate, a late debate about a potential bill on about care services. So here we have the same old argument at the parliament level, and then we have a debate coming from right-wing movements that supported the high debt in Argentina, and they argue on the grounds of fiscal costs. They don't want to discuss about it because it will entail a fiscal impact. An MP, the one who raised for abortion, also voted, and she said, we need to really speak about these topics. When haven't us feminist women taken this seriously? By that, he meant that strategically in Argentina, instead of discussing about the bill, it was chosen to start a debate on this bill to extend licenses for mothers, fathers, etc. So what is the main problem here? And again, this is a symptom of what Lissette was mentioning. When do really women have access to labor rights? When, if rights exclude migrants and informal workers? And the problem is, again, that the debate about licenses is prioritizing, reinforcing licenses for the protected private sector and is excluding, as a result of the fiscal cost that this entails, self-employed domestic workers, women in an irregular situation, which represent a very, very important percentage of workers in this field. So we have a first debate that we need to deal with, and we need to think about how to respond to this tuned narrative from the right-wing movement. And I'm thinking here about the panorama in Spain, which is not alien from what is happening in our latitudes. Here, the right wing allows itself to say publicly that we shall never speak about a sexual education bill. So, in this anti gender neoconservative move, well, in the same package, we are discussing the care agenda. Then there is another example from a lighthouse country, which amazingly articulated a debate between the feminism, the academia, etc., Uruguay. And in this case, it's very interesting because in the government, the Uruguay government, the narrative or the argument of the ministry is that the integral system is designed for rich countries only. So we need to prioritize resources. We're thinking about the budget and hierarchy. So here we have 2 points which are important. And the 4th point has to do with I believe that PPPs are a great opportunity to reflect about how the private sector is little by little penetrating into the care economy with the contribution of the state. And the last point, because I'm running almost out of time, which is about the digital dimension, the digitalization of the care economy. And I believe that here the alert, the red flag has to do with the combination that reinforces each other, not only in the South, but also in other countries. Again, we need to strongly respond to this combination of exploitation and datification of the care services, because here is an important possibility of the care sector becoming a source of somehow technological responses. So when we discuss about health, care, education, we know that all these sectors can greatly contribute, but at the same time we need to reflect about under what conditions. And here I'm referring to these 3, thinking about an eco-feminist transition, a fair transition. So this digitalization should never undermine data protection laws in the digital resources management, and this should allow us to broaden the scope of the agenda so that we can ask large corporations to contribute to investing in digital infrastructures, public digital infrastructures. And in this dialogue between the public digital infrastructure, there will be an interesting combination to reflect about the role or the demands we'll ask to large corporations, because as of today, they are not contributing and they escape any form of regulation in our countries, and they're having an incredible presence in the care sector. So, and well, part of this is perhaps what is undermining the financial capabilities of the state. I'm going to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Flora. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left for a quick round of questions and answers. I would encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A box. And for the time being, we have 2 questions. So if our panelists would like to turn on their cameras, I can then read out the questions to see who would like to answer. The first question reads as follows, and it has to do with one of the things that Flora was mentioning. How could this public care system look like, and whether or not they could be community managed as a transformative way forward? So this is one of the questions, i.e., what are the alternatives put forward by feminist movements? And the other question in the chat box is, how do we see the struggle for just and feminist transition in this new electoral stage in Spain, where just recently we've had municipal elections where we've seen far-right movements and right-wing movements gain power in many places. But this is also true in many other countries where you have right-wing or neoliberal movements expanding rapidly. So I don't know who would like to answer questions first. You'd have 2 minutes each for your answers.
The second question, no, to be completely honest, I'm not so well, I mean, I know what's happening in Spain, but I don't know in depth. So I'll leave that to the people in Spain. But on the second about what, sorry, on the first about what an alternative could look like. I mean, you do have many alternatives. I think the most important thing from our perspective is to take a life cycle approach. So that would see care services integrated into public health services. So they wouldn't be separate. And that's kind of a broader public service approach. But on the small community organized, if you look at the Nordic countries, a lot of the care there is organized by local and regional governments. So that is provided on the local level. And I mean, the conditions there do tend to be better than in other European countries. So I think on the local and regional government level, definitely, but importantly, it should be integrated into public health services.
Blanca or Lissette, we can follow the same order we followed before if you think that's okay. Okay. So in relation to the first question, I think we need this public discussion, including a community dimension, together with the social and solidarity economy perspective and the feminist perspective. Unfortunately, when thinking of examples of women's cooperatives in the field of care services, very often this is seen as a threat. And I think this is wrong. I mean, cooperativism, looking at cooperativism as an intrusion, I think is dangerous. You know, all of the alternatives arising from the communities, I mean, all of our rights, we've gained them thanks to the struggles by the communities. So self-management has to go hand in hand with public services. So I think public community systems should integrate care services on a more practical level. When it comes to public procurement, I think one first move would be for public contracting in the care services, stopped large corporations who are involved in care services or building infrastructures to take the bids. I know there are many sisters working in cooperatives, many of them racialized women that are in these cooperatives are stressing the importance of dignified working conditions and the dignity of the work they do. Therefore, I think there has to be publicly guaranteed services, but they should be managed at a community level. I wouldn't like to dwell on this too much, but moving on to the second question, how do we see our struggles? Well, I personally see a growing threat for feminist ideas. Once again, we see these far-right movements who deny climate change, or they are anti-gender groups, or groups that deny patriarchy or deny the impact that the model has on women and LGBTI communities is very worrying. So I think we're living under a serious threat. We see these narratives advancing, so we need a cross-sectoral approach of all feminisms. There's no single feminism. Struggles are diverse from trans feminisms. and we have to push forward, and we need to come up with policies that and push back all of those discourse denying gender, and we need to support the public services that are provided mainly by women. And I'd leave it at that. I think I've spoken for more than 2 minutes, also to give time to my colleagues. Thanks, Blanca. Lissette? I'd try to go back to some of the ideas that Blanca mentioned. I think it's really important to denounce the neoliberal state. States have to take on the responsibilities that they have. I mean, we know that they are imposing deep, violent and restrictive measures. We from our union are taking a very critical stance in the sense that we must speak out openly and say that socialist and left-wing governments, not just here in Spain or in the global north, but also in the global south, we are seeing that they are not responding to people's needs, much less so to the needs of those living on the margins. So states are profoundly neoliberal. They make laws and regulations as ambiguous as possible so that corporations can make a profit from the work done by migrant people, but also alternatives like with cooperativism. I'd like to go back to that because it also showcases a very interesting problem. Some groups or organizations cannot form a cooperative for migratory status, but that doesn't always have to be negative. You know, if we think of building alliances and self-management through cooperativism, and it would seem we have very strict boundaries of what cooperative should be, but they can push these boundaries. May seem, for instance, that cooperativism or self-managed spaces are not compatible, but we in our union we are a self-managed space made up by many undocumented women, and also we have to demand that fundamental rights are guaranteed at all times. Okay, Flora speaking now. Well, I'll be short. When we think of alternatives and what could be done to guarantee a public care sector, I think one fundamental discussion has to do with budget and investment. We need to look at who they're trying to save on this, what some call economic recovery stage. Within the frame of the discussions going on in Argentina, there was an interesting paper done by De Justicia. It's a very short and strong document for MPs and legislators, even for those with progressive arguments on how to defend the need to finance public care services and the cost of this. I think this is the root of the feminist traditions, you know, to study and strengthen and having strong, powerful data. Sometimes data is not enough, but it's important to have data. So I'd recommend you read this paper by De Justicia. Then we need to strengthen all of the discussions on labor protection for platform economy workers. That will strengthen the struggle of most workers who in the digital economy sector are migrant people. And we can join this with paid domestic workers. And here I think we have to raise the flag of feminism and build solidarity at an international level. And also what we are seeing here in Argentina is that there is an interesting movement around cooperativism in the care sector. Very recently, there was a first meeting to share experiences among cooperativists. And I think this big discussion here is that social and solidarity economy or cooperative economy can't just be something secondary. It must be looked at as something strategic. When you articulate care, social solidarity economy, and ecofeminist visions, what we see is that there is a proposal to guarantee that these services are provided in a framework of rights and collectively managed. And I think that the response of the state forging alliances with the private sector, well, there I think what we have to do is push forward, and we need, even as Lisa was saying, in the more progressive sectors, we still need to do a lot of advocacy. Okay, thank you all very much. I think it was really interesting to listen to your interventions, and you stuck to time wonderfully. And well, I think it's time to wrap up. To conclude, I'd like to pick up on some of the things you have said that I think are very powerful. The first idea is that idea that our care model should be a model where there's no private profit, where large corporations shouldn't be able to make a profit. And it's important to go back to something Tuscany said initially. When we talk of these automatic, repetitive tasks to increase their profitability, and I think that in this field, it's important to include the discussion on self-management, social solidarity economy, because they are the opposite of this institutionalized and bureaucratic care model, another system where the people receiving these care are put at the heart or at the center. And also, I think it's fundamental that in light of the risk that we see with the new right-wing governments to just give up and to lose rights. So I think it's fundamental to continue denouncing this progressive, quote unquote, progressive neoliberalism, or this form of progressiveness that is neoliberal. They talk a lot about rights, but they don't guarantee rights for all. And to face the many faces of neoliberalism, we have to recover the power of feminisms. And I think the pandemic has stopped us from having a generational transition and to learn from all of the feminist strikes. But those who participated in those feminist strikes, I think we need to continue recovering the powerful mobilizations that we did back in the day and recover our mottos. And one way of reclaiming reproductive justice, saying that when we said that if our lives and our work are worthless, then let them produce without us. We challenged the model, and we did it with massive demonstrations and powerful demonstrations. There are many interests in dividing feminisms, and maybe perhaps we've forgotten that while we go on fighting and insulting each other, there are many, many women who live under exploitation and huge vulnerability, and that calls for us to continue denouncing these inequalities and exploitation. I think we will all agree that we need to go back to that strong feminist movement appealing to a broad group of people where everyone has their place and where the voices of women who are facing greater exploitation are put at the center and given greater visibility. I'd like to thank you all once again for sharing this space with us. I think it was really interesting, and I hope we can continue sharing, especially with those we hadn't met before. Tuscany, thank you so much for joining this webinar despite the language barriers. And thank you all. And we hope to be able to continue our collaboration in the future. Thank you so much. I don't know if you'd like to have some concluding remarks or whether we call it a day.
Just to say thank you very much for inviting me. It was very interesting.
Thank you all. Hope to see you soon. Thank you all very much. and let's continue collaborating. Thank you all. Goodbye. Thank you. The webinar will be available online on the YouTube channel of ODG in a couple of days. So if you want to watch it or share, you will be able to do so very soon. Thank you all very much.